Hey everybody, glad to have you with us again as we're going through 1 Corinthians chapter 9. We've got a jam-packed text today. I mean, there's just so much information and it's long. So we're just going to dive right in. Want to quickly remind you to like, follow, subscribe. All those things help us out to advance the podcast. If you're able to do those things, please do that and continue to do that. It is such a great blessing for us in the work that we're doing, and we pray that God will continue to bless you through this work and through this ministry, ultimately for His glory and for your good. So we'll look at 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 19 to 23. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 19 to 23. For though I am free from all people, I have made myself a slave to all so that I might gain more. To the Jews I became as a Jew so that I might gain the Jews. To those who are under the law, I became as one under the law, though not being under law myself, so that I might gain those who are under the law. To those who are without the law, I became as one without the law, though not being without the law of God, but under the law of Christ, so that I might gain those who are without the law. To the weak, I became as weak, that I might gain the weak. I have become all things to all people, so that I may by all means save some. I do all things for the sake of the gospel, so that I may become a fellow partaker of it. As we mentioned, today's text is loaded. And this is probably, I think, one of the most famous texts of Paul as it pertains to evangelism and our attitudes of what evangelism should be and how we should be individually and then more collectively as congregations and that sort of thing. To set the context, Paul is in the midst of arguing that partaking of food offered to idols in an idol's temple isn't appropriate for the Corinthian Christians. And you'd be like, is that really the context of this? Yeah, it is indeed. He started by arguing that the Corinthians should have empathy and showcase their knowledge and maturity through love instead of presenting an inflated self-importance. Paul has shown that partaking of food offered to idols is a sin against these newer, younger, less knowledgeable Christians, and even more so as a sin against Christ because it leads them to give credence to an idol that only belongs to God in Christ. Check out chapter 8 to hear more about that. As such, the quote-unquote mature Christians, and it's hard to say that because they fancy themselves mature, they may have more experience, but part of what Paul's trying to do in this whole situation is to show that they're not actually living in maturity as they should. But regardless, we'll call them the mature Christians, quote unquote, for those of you listening on the podcast. They should forgo this asserted right, just as Paul would, out of a passion for their fellow Christians' holiness. And then Paul even going on to say he'd skip meat altogether, regardless of its source, to keep people from sinning. Paul then gives a seemingly hard shift that we've pointed out several times to talk about the right of gospel workers to receive financial compensation in order for the gospel to go forward, not for the exploitation of Christians or for their own enlargement, but so they can stay focused on ministry. When Paul does this, he even observes that this is the ordinance of God. It's the will of God that this would be the case. However, we saw last time, Paul isn't just bringing up this reality to flex or to fundraise, but that is rather to say that he's refused this right, which he most certainly had over the Corinthians. So the Corinthians, these mature, quote-unquote Corinthians, have to square with the fact that they have had greater access to the gospel and less offense because Paul denied his personal rights. And the implication there is you should too. That think about what I did for you so you could know Christ, now have this same love for the other people to edify and to build up rather than to destroy. Paul shows the degree to which one should be willing to do that in our big idea today, which is to adapt for the gospel. Adapt for the gospel. We're going to look at number 1, become all things. Number 2, conformity isn't carnality. And number 3, you may save some. So become all things, conformity isn't carnality, and you may save some. Become, conformity, and save. All right, as we mentioned, this text famously shows and is an extended discussion of Paul's willingness to adapt to the people around him. And he shows that the Corinthians are not special in this regard, but this is part of what makes his ministry for the advancement of the gospel tick, that he wants to conform to other people as much as is allowable. Rather than taking this a line at a time, the Jews and the under the law and all that sort of stuff, I just want to note these adaptation statements together to show Paul's heart. That Paul says at the start that he's free, but he's made himself a slave. He's made himself a slave to win others. You can go back to the statements about liberty and freedom in chapter 8. He's trying to say, hey, look, I've got liberty. I'm free, but I've become a slave so that they can know Christ. That is, Paul didn't live according to his own will, but principally to the will of Christ, and then to what would give the other person the most benefit as a representation of the twofold commandment to love God and to love neighbor as oneself. Paul is all about this. Paul is to do what will honor God and bless others always above his own will. As such, he will take on whatever aspects of the person's culture and their understanding is necessary for the blessing of that person. Notice he describes Jews, those who are under the law, those who are without the law, the weak, and all people, as though there was someone that was missed in this case. These people lived in different ways. If we consider the Jews, those under the law, and those who are without the law, it's hard to see the difference between the Jews and those under the law. It could mean those kind of cultural Jews, who maybe were no longer keeping the law, or those under the law as Gentiles who had come under that. It's hard to say. Regardless, we'll just take them together. But if we just look at the Jews and the Gentiles, to make this very simple here, very different cultures, very different standards. It's quite obvious that food is different. The kosher versus non-kosher distinction was a massive and huge part of the distinctiveness of these peoples. But Paul was willing to embrace the things about these people in order to connect with them. We might think about other aspects of culture, such as dress or etiquette. How do you behave at a diner that serves greasy burgers versus at a steak restaurant? Those are just two different sets of behaviors, and you should behave in different ways that accord with the society and the cultural standard within them. We shouldn't try to stick out for its own purpose. We shouldn't try to make a point and be obvious. We should try to blend in and be in union with them as much as possible. We'll talk about what that means for those of you who got alarm bells going off. But I just want to say this work is exhausting. Okay? This work is exhausting to try to interact with a person who is different than us and to try to connect with them. But what it means to be a slave of them is you connect with them on their terms. You connect with them on their terms, not on yours and not on mine. But that's precisely what it means to be a slave to all, the fact that it's a lot of work. It means that to the best of our abilities, we shape every action around what will get that person closer to Jesus. There's far too much to look at in all this. But for our second point, I want to untangle one of the more convoluted statements because I believe it's one of the most crucial. It comes out of verse 21, where Paul says, "To those who are without the law, I became as one without the law, though not being without the law of God, but under the law of Christ, so that I might gain those who are under the law." As I mentioned, this statement is a touch different than the others because of this extended parenthetical qualifier. The rest of the statements are basically to X, I became X to win X. So to this particular group of people, I acted like that particular group of people so that they could get closer to Jesus. And indeed, this has the same structure, but this qualifier is so important. To those without law, I became without law, but not without law towards God, but under law towards Christ. What Paul's trying to clarify is that those who don't live according to the law, he doesn't mean any sort of moral construct or standard. Excuse me. He doesn't mean any sort of rules. What he means is just the law of Moses and those people who had the cultural distinction there. What Paul's trying to clarify is amongst those who were not Jewish by birth and didn't honor the law of Moses, Paul adopted the certain cultural norms, such as food, potentially dress, etiquette, but he didn't conform to the things that were ungodly. He didn't conform to the things that were ungodly. Basically, the thing that identified Gentile culture to the Jews was idolatry. That's, as you read Paul, idolatry is the major thing about the Gentiles that really, in a lot of ways, defines them as a people. Paul certainly didn't go into an idol's temple and partake in the drunken, reveling orgies just to be relatable, to connect with people. He didn't do that. He didn't find himself in sin there. As the supporting idea says, conformity isn't carnality. The places we conform are exactly and only in every but only matter of liberty and freedom. In all those, we must be willing to conform every area for the sake of someone's soul, but we don't compromise for a moment on matters of truth. For example, we can talk with the literal language of the people we're using. Like if they speak a different language, we can try to learn that language to engage with them. Or we can use the various manners of speech and all that sort of thing to try to connect with people. We can do all those sorts of things. But we don't have to speak with crassness or off-colorness or inappropriate things. We can dress similarly to the people around us in terms of the types of clothes we wear, the cuts of garments, the colors, the literal fabrics, but we still do it in a way that's modest and that doesn't expose ourselves inappropriately. A classic example is assemblies. We need to have assemblies that are coherent to the culture around us. But in many places, this passage is used to turn assemblies into spectacles that attract attention and certain people because, we got to get them excited and we got to build a bridge. Well, we can have assemblies that reflect the style, customs, norms, and expectations that are freedoms and liberties of the people around us, but they must not devolve into some sort of unsanctimonious frivolity. For the final point, we want to notice the point of all this is to save people. It's to allow the power of the gospel and the message of Jesus Christ to reach into their hearts and to affect them so that they abandon the lies that have enslaved them and they walk according to the truth. Part of the reason we can't be lawless towards Christ is because we can't save someone when we're not actually connected to Christ. Further, as we think about this, I want to notice Paul's statements at the end of verse 22 and verse 23. First, he says, I become all things to all people that I may by all means save some. We need to be realistic in our expectations here about what's going on, because Paul was. One of the key things I do in prep, and I would encourage you to as you study your Bible, especially when you get pens and paper and things like that, and you're really doing some work on it, is to notice the words that are repeated. And one of the words that's repeated is all. Throughout, Paul is saying all. I become all things to all people, so that my all means, and then the thing you might expect is for him to save all people, but that's not what he says, but to save some. Unfortunately, this is up to the will of God and to the hearts of people. We need to be about this work and continually work to find bridges and engage with people around us and around the world, but we need to also recognize the planting and the watering we do in this case are not what gives the increase. As such, don't grow discouraged when you try to relate someone or when and it doesn't work. Or you build a bridge so that the gospel can have an effect on someone and it doesn't work, but rejoice for the opportunity, work and learn to do better so that they too might be saved. And then on the other hand, recognize that not everyone's going to respond to this perfectly. We don't need to try to throw some baby out with the bathwater to try and create a spectacle. This isn't about creating a spectacle. It's about creating legitimate connection so that they can see that you perceive their needs and how the gospel will meet those deepest longings in their heart. So I have this incredible text, and I know we're probably running over here as I check the time. Yep, okay. But there's so much here. And it's so transformative as the way we think about what the gospel demands of us in our relation to other people. Strictly speaking, Paul is using this to showcase his complete surrender of freedom and enslavement to the norms of others for their salvation, with the implication that the Corinthians should surrender their asserted freedom to partake of idols, temples, and the feast thereof. As such, we need to work to be all things to all people personally. Fundamentally, the gospel is about connecting people to Christ. That we, as we declare the gospel, we're about connecting people to Christ. And we cannot do that if we're not connected to both of those. In order to connect people to Christ through the gospel, you have to be connected to Christ. And you have to be connected to people. Being connected to Christ and people means that you are a slave to both, with Christ taking precedence. So we need to adapt to the norms of the people around us, but never compromise on the standards of Christ. And we need to ask and look really hard. Are the things we're doing, are the ways we're conducting ourselves, are the way we're engaging with culture, presenting ourselves as a blessing to other people, as a servant to other people, or is it, I'll just do it my way and call that the Jesus way? We need to be careful about that. Paul is willing to live his life as a slave to all and to submit to every single preference to the good of others. He identifies that as partaking and participating in the gospel. Stick with me here. This is living out and participating in the gospel. When we sacrifice what's comfortable for us, what's normal to us, what we know, what's easy for us to connect to someone else, you're embodying the gospel of Christ. You're embodying what Christ has done, who did the same for us. That he sacrificed what was comfortable and easy and known to him to create a connection and reconciliation to humanity. So this is tremendously difficult. It's tremendously difficult. But declaring the transcendence of the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ is worth it every single time. So labor in joy. So think about some questions here. Do you view yourself as a slave to others? Do you live for their joy, their blessing, their betterment, their connection to God? Or do you walk around expecting people to cater to you? Which is it? Do you walk around expecting that people are just going to take care of your stuff and you're the most important person in the room, or are others more important? Are you willing to get outside your comfort zone and engage with others so that they can know Christ? Are there certain liberties in your personality which you refuse to adjust in matters of dress or style or conversation or whatever it is so that others can know Christ? Are you willing to sacrifice what you know so that others can know Christ, just like he did for you? Thank you so much for joining us today here at 15 Minutes and a Big Idea. Today's big idea: adapt for the gospel.